Mexican Americans in the Southwest, 1870 to 1900. The period between 1870 to 1900 was a violent transitional period. Specifically for Mexican Americans, they were experiencing a change to the way that they lived before in the lands that were part of Mexico. Mexican Americans and Anglos competed for land. Mexican Americans tried their best through the legal system to keep what they had, and Anglos tried their best to use the system to take over land. And land at this time meant also expanding economic and political power. The newcomer had the upper hand in the changes that were coming. Mexican American people based their lives on a ranching economy, which changes with the introduction of an agricultural economy towards the end of the 19th century. The newcomer had the right connections to make the change or to start a new life or new lives in the Southwest, while the Mexican American, in most cases, didn't have the funding to make that transition, losing in the process whatever land he had left by the turn of the century. At the end, the one-time owners of vast ranches all across northern Mexico were about to become landless wage workers, sometimes working the same land that once belonged to them and their families. The Southern Pacific Railroad alone owned more land than all of the rancheros combined in the Southwest. The Southern Pacific Railroad was the state's largest employer in California. It advertised in the East Coast and abroad for people to buy land from them. It established and employed people through agencies and recruited many settlers. Industrial growth, or the industrialization of the United States, meant heavy demand for cheap labor. The introduction of rapid expansion of the railroads accelerated the transition and continuous expansion of the American economy. The West provided the resources for the eastern markets, the cattle, and the grain production financed by foreign investment, which takes over the Southwest economy. Discrimination towards Mexican and Mexican American wage labor and the market increases. A dual wage labor system is created, and this system does not only affect Mexican American people, but it affects other minoritized groups. In the 1860s, various natural disasters that occurred in California affect land ownership of Mexican Americans. For example, in 1862, there was a flood that ended up killing many heads of cattle in Mexican ranches. To make things worse, from between 1862 to 1864, California experiences 2 years of drought, leading to the loss of more cattle for many people that did have ranches, many of whom were Mexican American. The loss of land meant loss of political power, and Mexicans or Mexican Americans without land or money to white supremacists or racist whites were no more than, in quote, just greasers. Piece by piece, Mexican American people, landowners, sold or lost their land. In many cases, sold parts of the land to pay for their mortgages, to keep as much as they could. But at the end, they end up losing all of the land that they once had. An example of this land grant includes the land grants owned by Domingo Peralta, a Mexican-American landowner in Northern California. He owned a rancho called Rancho San Antonio in what is today Alameda County in Northern California. This rancho was given to him in 1820. This was a 44,800 acre land grant, granted by him by Governor Pablo Vicente de Sola, the last Spanish governor of Alta California. This was given to Don Luis Maria Peralta, who was a sergeant in the Spanish Army and later Commissioner of Pueblo de San Jose, in recognition of his 40 years of service in the Spanish Colonial Army in Alta California. The land grant embraced the sites of San Leandro, Oakland, Alameda, Emeryville, Piedmont, Berkeley, and Albany, all of these located in Northern California. In 1852, Domingo Peralta filed a claim with the U.S. Land Commission, so do his brothers. Also in 1852, the town of Oakland and Alameda County are incorporated. Rancho San Antonio becomes part of Alameda County. Between the years of 1852 and 1853, Vicente Peralta and Domingo Peralta sell a total of 1,000 acres for $192,000. In 1852, the city of Oakland is incorporated. In 1854, the Land Commission confirms a portion of Rancho San Antonio to Domingo and Vicente Peralta. The commission confirms all of the claims of Antonio and Ignacio Peralta. In 1855, the U.S. District Court confirms a whole portion of Rancho San Antonio claimed by Domingo and Vicente Peralta. In 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court confirms all of the land in question to the Peralta brothers. However, in the year of 1858, 200 white squatters and 1,000 gun-carrying settlers ambushed surveyors and held Peralta hostage. This means that they created a living hell for these Mexican-American ranchers in Northern California. This is a type of experiences the Mexican-American people had to endure in this transitional period. Salvador Vallejo was related to Mariano Vallejo, one of the most important persons in the history of Alta California. Rather than losing every piece of the Salvador Vallejo land grant, this land grant eventually gets sold for $160,000. However, by the time that this is processed by the California courts, the legal fees cost about half of those profits that were made from this land. In other words, Mexican American people had land, they had to go through the court system. This took years, and those years took a lot of money. And many times Mexican American people had to sell pieces of their land to save their land grants. And at times they end up with little pieces of land or no land left at all. Not an easy process. These years are also marked by extreme violence against other groups in the United States. And this is aggression against Native American First Nations by the United States government through the United States military. This period is known as the Indian Wars. Various historical massacres or killings of whole Indian nations, including women and children, took place during this period. This is something that is not new in this period. This has been happening since the beginning of colonial times and has not stopped. But in this period, as the United States and its population is moving west, the violence reaches extreme levels. Some of these examples of violence include the following. The first one is the Sand Creek Massacre that happened in 1864 in the state of Colorado, or the territory of Colorado, where more than 750 peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho natives, led by Chief Black Kettle, were forced to abandon their winter campsite near Fort Lyon in southeastern Colorado. This is where U.S. volunteer Colorado soldiers attacked and slaughtered 148 men, women, and children. The next one is known as Red Cloud's War, and this happened in 1866 as the United States opens up space or territory and roads for U.S. settlers to exploit the mineral wealth of land, in this case specifically in Montana. Native American people resist this intrusion and violence that comes with these people. Lakota Chief Red Cloud, with other Native American people, resist this intrusion and attack settlers and soldiers to protect their traditional ways and their native lands. Initially, the United States and the U.S. Army leave the area and the population that was coming in, and a treaty is signed. This treaty is called the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868. This protects the sacred Black Hills located in western South Dakota and northeastern Wyoming as part of the Great Sioux Reservation. However, after gold is discovered in the Black Hills, the U.S. government begins by establishing a military post and provoking Native American people again. Here, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse defend this territory and fight back against this intrusion. This leads to the Battle of the Little Big Horn that takes place on June 25th, 1876, where General George Armstrong Custer leads a 600-man group into the Little Big Horn Valley, where they were defeated by approximately 3,000 Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne warriors led by Crazy Horse. Custer and his 600 men were killed in battle. This is known as Custer's last stand and is one of the most important historical moments for Indian people. Even though the Lakota Sioux defeat the U.S. Army in this victory, the U.S. government comes back and forces the Sioux to sell the Black Hills and leave the land. The U.S. Army fought multiple skirmishes and battles with Native people, and in many cases they end up losing these wars. This is something that not only happens here, but also happens in other territories, from Oklahoma, Texas, all the way to California. Eventually, we know what happens in Arizona and Sonora with Apache medicine man by the name of Geronimo, who ends up escaping with his followers the reservation that Apache people are being forced to live at from around 1850 to about 1886. Another important historical moment that is important to mention here is the Wounded Knee Massacre. In the late 19th century, in the late 1800s, one of the things that Native American people were experiencing is something called the ghost dance, or the period of the ghost dance. This period, or this expression, comes out of desperation of being invaded, defeated, massacred, having to defend themselves and be always in the defensive against the intrusion of their native lands. So they create these ghost dances to deal with the trauma and the psychological damage and the physical damage that has been happening to them through these intrusions and the violence that is done on them by not only the U.S. population and the settlers, but also the United States military. The idea of the ghost dance is that these Native American nations believe that through this dancing ritual, they are going to be able to reunite with the dead and bring peace, prosperity, and culture back to themselves and to their people. On December 29, 1890, the U.S. Army surrounded a group of ghost dancers at Wounded Knee Creek near the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. There, a fight breaks out, and 150 Native people are slaughtered. This battle was the last major conflict between the U.S. government and the Plains Indians. Another important part of this historical period is the Homestead Act of 1862. But what is it? The Homestead Act was a policy that was signed by President Abraham Lincoln, granting Americans 160 acres of land that was public or owned by the government for a very small price or a very small filing fee. This is considered one of the most important pieces of legislation in these years, which leads to Western expansion and allows citizens of the United States from all walks of life, including African Americans, formerly enslaved people, women, and immigrants, to become landowners in this country. Maybe this is the idea, or where the idea of the American dream comes from. The Homestead Act stayed active for 124 years until it was repealed in 1976 and resulted in 10% of U.S. land, or 270 million acres of land, to be claimed and settled. This is how the United States expanded into the West. There were about 4 million homestead claims and 1.6 million deeds in 30 states that were officially obtained. Montana, North Dakota, Colorado, Nebraska were the states that had the most successful claims, or the most claims. But to achieve this, thousands of Native American people were forced off their lands and into Indian reservations to make way for homesteaders. When it came down to the southwest of the United States, Mexican American people were also mistreated, or they're the ones that lost part of these lands to make them available to the public. What were the requirements for this to go through? To make a claim, a homesteader had to pay a filing fee of $18. Those $18 would be divided in various parts. $10 would be paying a fee to make a temporary claim on the land. $2 as commission to the land agent, and an additional $6 as a final payment to receive an official patent on the land. Land titles could also be purchased from the government for $1.25 per acre following 6 months of proven residency. And of course, like anything, there were land speculators and people that took advantage of this system and the loopholes within the system, and ended up taking more land than they needed, or building in land that wasn't theirs. While this happened, Native American people were put in reservations in many cases throughout these years. As I spoke in the last slide about the Indian Wars, and Native American tribal members would be assigned 160-acre plots instead of sharing land as a tribe. This also opened Native American land for these homesteaders. Now, getting back to Mexican American people and Mexican American experiences. Remember this concept? I talked about this concept in a past lecture. This is the concept of lynchocracia, which is equated to the experience that Mexican American people had in these years from 1850 to about 1930. And lynchocracia means the way that Mexican American people that were suspected of being involved in a crime or engaged in criminal activity would be guilty by their racial association. African American people were lynched in big numbers in the South. Mexican American people were also lynched in the Southwest. The numbers at the very top of this slide, they indicate the percentages of Mexican American land ownership, specifically in California in 1860, at about 29%, and in 1870 from 5 to 10%. The next set of information is the total number of lynchings of Mexican American people between 1848 to 1928, and from 1848 to 1860 there were 163 Mexicans hanged in California, and more specifically between 1850 and 1870 there were 77 public hangings in LA County alone. The image that you're looking at here in this slide is of Juanita. We talked about her in a past lecture. The first Mexican woman and only woman that was hanged in California. Again, this next slide is about California land ownership, and Mexican and Mexican American people going from cattle ranching to large-scale agricultural economy. This is the end of the Mexican cattle ranching economy and also marks the end of Mexican American political influence in California as it was in the past. These next numbers are repeated from a previous slide. Another thing that is created out of this period is a dual labor system that is applicable not just to Mexican and Mexican American people, but it's also applicable to many other minoritized populations in the United States. A dual labor system means that amount of pay or the wages that were given to Mexican American and Mexican workers were different than their white counterparts because of their racial association. That also indicates that there was a preference in the type of jobs that were given to Anglos as opposed to Mexican and Mexican American people. That also includes promotion, etc. What is a fact in these years is that Mexican and Mexican American people do have a big impact in the infrastructure that is built in the former Mexican territories. Mexican American people have a continuous presence in many of their places that Mexican people lived before. So for example, in Los Angeles, I have a picture here of Placita Olvera, which is the beginning of Los Angeles, but there is also the place that we know today as East Los Angeles, which at this point was known as Sonorita Town, which is a place that was familiar to Mexican and Mexican American people that goes back to the Spanish and Mexican period. In some places, the Mexican and Mexican American people were a significant percentage of the population. You can see here the Mexican and Mexican American people are becoming a minority. So for example, in LA, the city of Los Angeles, in 1850, Mexicans had 1,331 people, and Anglos about 3,000. And as you go into the 1880s, that number changes. And every decade into the present time, those numbers keep shifting. And that would be the case in many cities like Phoenix, San Antonio, San Diego, etc., etc. This also gives you a look into what kind of jobs each one of these groups did. 65% of Mexicans were employed as manual laborers, meaning that they were not gaining opportunities as much as Anglos. In other words, much of the opportunities that existed for good paying jobs went to Anglos, and therefore they benefited from the success of cities, the economy, and so on and so forth. When it came down to accessing public health, Mexican American people in most cases had to depend on their knowledge of traditional medicine, because even though at this time doctors did house calls instead of you going to a clinic or hospital, that did not exist as today. Mexican people, the majority of Mexican people had to pay for these doctors to come home and take care of somebody. And the cost for a doctor's visit to your home was about $10, which was an average weekly salary for most Mexicans. So you would have to make a choice between getting a doctor to come to your house or figuring out what was wrong with the person and using traditional remedies that Mexican and Mexican American people have used for centuries, pretty much. This period also marks a first wave of migrations from Mexico into the Southwest. As the Southwest begins to expand and build its railroads, Mexican and Mexican American people are part of that infrastructure building, as well as in the introduction of farming. In 1880, 43,161 Mexican people are in Texas, and that number increases to 71,062 Mexicans in Texas. This means that people are migrating from Mexico and increasing the population. And most of this population lives and works below San Antonio, where there are many farms that need this type of work and this type of workers. Unlike California and Texas, the state or the territory at this point of Nuevo Mexico is a place that is where the majority of Mexican American people live after the U.S.-Mexican War in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. San Miguel County, Nuevo Mexico, is a place that at this point in history has about 90% Mexican American population. This is the largest county in all of Nuevo Mexico. A place like most of the Southwest for Mexican American people, a place that is based on cattle or ranching and a trade economy that is also working at the same time with people making money from having wage labor, working in railroads, commercial, agriculture, and again, ranching. Just like in California and Texas, some people in Nuevo Mexico end up losing land and end up having to take whatever wages are available to them. There is also a wealthy class of Nuevo Mexicanos that work very closely with wealthy Anglo ranchers and people within the railroad world, and they will also exploit the working class Nuevo Mexicanos. In this case, we have a place called Las Vegas, Nuevo Mexico, where there is a traditional Mexican American economy that is interrupted or that is influenced by a new wave of people coming in with money, investment, gentrification, if you will, that creates competition for land, water, and timber. This new town is funded by Anglo money, new money, and this creates racial tension between Anglos and their rich Nuevo Mexicano allies versus working class Nuevo Mexicanos. These experiences and transition that we're talking about here get published in a local newspaper here in this part of Nuevo Mexico called La Voz del Pueblo. You can look into this source and you can read about this transition and what people are experiencing in these years. In the same place of Las Vegas, Nuevo Mexico, there is a 500,000 acre land grant that is being fought for between two different parties in 1877. And in Nuevo Mexico, there is this saying that goes a little something like this: Cuando vino el alambre, llegó el hambre. When the barbed wire came, hunger also came with it. And that means that many people in Nuevo Mexico practice something called communal land grants. And that means that people in Nuevo Mexico share the resources of these lands, including the open fields, for cattle grazing, for access to water, to timber, and many other things that they needed for their ranching economies. But when Anglos came, they brought with them barbed wire, and with barbed wire, they end up putting up fences and cutting off access to many different spaces that traditionally Nuevo Mexicanos had access to. As a result of this, the people of Nuevo Mexico rise up, and in 1889 they create a clandestine guerrilla type poor farmers organization demanding equal rights and for their land back, and for them to be able to live in the way that they lived before these changes came to them. This group was headed by the Herrera brothers. The one in the middle is Juan Jose Herrera, who served as mayor of Las Vegas. He was a veteran of the Civil War. He was also a labor union organizer that had skills to speak various languages. Recruited members from different population centers in Nuevo Mexico, including Santa Fe, San Miguel, Taos, Colfax, and northern Nuevo Mexico. Some members also came from southern Colorado. They claimed that they fought to defend the life, the interests, and the reputation of family members, and they would fight for these people's rights. And they rode horses, and they made a stand against these changes that came into their communities. Some of the actions that they engaged in included cutting fences and destroying property, burning crops and farm equipment. They destroyed railroad bridges and tracks in an effort to get the attention of the ranchers and to let them know, the Anglo ranchers and the businessmen that were working with the wealthy Nuevo Mexicanos, to let them know that they would not stand there and just watch these take place in their homeland. Between 1889 and 1890, the Las Gorras Blancas were very active. In 1890, 200 armed members marched in Las Vegas with slogans like the White Caps, 1,500 strong and growing daily, making statements and warning anybody in this town not to cut or sell lumber for railroad building unless it was at the approved price of Las Gorras Blancas, again using union tactics to maintain a good price and good paying wage jobs for people. And this is what they preach, and also what they protected, or what they push forward. So they had the armed guerrilla group, but they also had an actual labor group called Los Caballeros de Labor, or the Knights of Labor. And this group of Mexican American people had ideas that were actually pretty advanced for the time, which included the demand of free public education for kids, public elections, and protection for workers from monopolies. The slogan was that the people were king and the public officials were their humble servants, and they had to obey what the people ordered them to do, not the other way around. Eventually, Las Gorras Blancas and Los Caballeros de Labor and the governor of Nuevo Mexico intervenes and tries to include New Mexicans in the political process and pushes for legislation to protect their rights. Some of these leaders of the Las Gorras Blancas end up as politicians for the territory of Nuevo Mexico. The fences didn't go back up. Some people end up leaving to southern Colorado, and not all of the issues get addressed. At this point, you have the first Mexican-American political party called El Partido del Pueblo Unido. This political party would last for some years, but eventually it won't be until 1970 that, again, Mexican-American people will organize again and create a new political party called El Partido Nacional de la Raza Unida. It's important to also point out that in the 1960s, as part of the Chicano movement, one of the most important Chicano movement icons, Reyes Lopez Tijerina, helped organize people in this area of Nuevo Mexico to fight for a land grant, specifically in Tierra Amarilla, Nuevo Mexico. I will talk about this a little bit later. Actually, I talk about this in Chicano Studies 102 when I talk about the Chicano movement. But there's a connection between what happens here, this political party, and also fighting for land grants. Arizona and Nuevo Mexico take some time to become states. They remain territories until 1912. And the reason for that is similar to the reason why the United States didn't take all of Mexico, and that is because of racism and white supremacy. Because they believe in Congress, some of the congressmen, that Nuevo Mexico was too Catholic, too foreign, and inferior, and they didn't trust Mexican American people as being loyal. They believed that New Mexico was underdeveloped or too Mexican. Part of a quote from Congress says about 2/3 of the population is of the Mongol breed, known as Mexicans, and harbor anti-Mexican sentiment, end quote. But Mexican American people, specifically of Nuevo Mexico, will show the United States that they are loyal, and they join the United States in the Spanish-American War. Here you have out of the 17,000 people that fought in the Spanish-American War, about 1,200 were from Nuevo Mexico. Mostly volunteers. Coming back to California, it's important to mention that the last San Diego mayor of Mexican heritage was Juan Maria Marron in 1848. Any of you that are traveling or that go to the mall in Carlsbad, you can see that there is a street named after this gentleman there, close to the mall. Here is a picture of San Diego, and this is about how there was a transition in which Old Town, or where Old Town is located, was the center of politics, or the center of the town of San Diego for a very long time, between 1850 and 1860, following the U.S.-Mexican War and during the Civil War. But eventually, by the 1870s, new San Diegans moved closer to the bay, and eventually, by 1871, the municipal government of San Diego moved from Old Town area to close to the bay. And Old Town remains a Mexican barrio. And later on, the place that takes over or takes this importance in San Diego history would be Logan Heights, today known as Barrio Logan, where Chicano Park is located. This is a description of Mexican Old Town in the year of, or the decade of the 1870s, to give you an idea of the presence of people that were living there. So again, in the 1870s, there's still people living in Old Town, but there is a new town being founded closer to the bay, which later on becomes the city of San Diego. And that ends this lecture. Thank you so much. Take care, and I will see you in the